Shalom, my friends. Tonight we're going to be discussing on a Rabbi cross-examines the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So sit tight. We'll be right back. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac from our northern friends up in Canada, the land of free health insurance. Free health care, excuse me. Is that how that works? Hey, I'm amazed by by the stuff that I hear and stuff that you learn. I got to figure out these daggum noms. Wow. There we go. There it goes. So anyway, yeah, every time I think of Canada, I'm thinking, man, I got to go up there sometime. Just to, maybe I'll rent an apartment for like a week just to get free health care. Anyway, yeah. Okay, whatever. So how are you, sir? It's good to see you again.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I hear you.
First, you got to pay high Canadian taxes first.
I see. I guess that would make sense for sure. All right, so 1 Corinthians chapter, I think at the beginning of last week's video, I said we were doing 1 Corinthians chapter 9, but in my mind I knew we were on 8, and everything else advertised 8. Well, tonight we are on 9, so we will have this thing lined up here pretty soon. So I'm going to put your stuff on screen like normal. 1 Corinthians 9er, BR549er, there you go. And there we go. So, Rabbi, the platform is yours. It's good to see you again.
Good to be back.
Yes, sir.
And, wow. So, 1 Corinthians 9, in some ways, is following up on the major theme from last week. What we saw last week was that Paul discusses the question of whether a Christian is allowed to eat from offerings to idols, to pagan, idolatrous idols. And what we saw was that Paul believes that in principle there's nothing wrong with it. He felt that because idols are just nonsense, they're nothing, they're not real, idolatry is really worshiping something that's false. So he felt that any sacrifices that were offered to such meaningless non-entities, nothing really happens to them. As far as he's concerned, there's nothing to see underneath, the cover. There's nothing that's happened, nothing real, nothing significant. He feels that the food that's offered to these idols does not become tainted or impure or, it really should be prohibited. However, Paul goes on to say in the chapter, it's really, in many ways, the topic of the chapter, which is that even though, a Christian would be at liberty, would have the freedom to eat such food, he felt that it's not always appropriate if it would lead other Christians of weaker spiritual natures to stumble. He felt that it could be that some immature Christians who may not realize that idolatry is as ridiculous as it really is, and they may harbor feelings that maybe there is something to it. Paul felt that if such Christians that were immature did participate in eating the food that was offered to idols, they theoretically could get dragged back into idolatry themselves. We saw that there were maybe other reasons why Paul felt it could be dangerous. In any event, that was the major theme that we saw last week, that even though such behavior would be in principle theoretically permitted, Paul, in terms of his own practice said that he would never eat such meat, and he would never eat meat in general. I think he said he became a vegan because he doesn't want to lead people astray. So picking up on this, what happens in chapter 9, 1 Corinthians, is that Paul goes through a long description of how the church really is responsible for sustaining and really supporting apostles, or really anyone that's in ministry. They really should be supported by the church at large. And what's going on here is that Paul is going to say that even though he is entitled to such support, and even though as an apostle it's something which is coming to him, Paul is going to say, but I don't take any such support, basically because he's afraid that it might create the wrong impression. People might walk away thinking that he's only in it for the money, and it might have a negative impact on his preaching, on his ministry. So it's similar to last week in that something which is potentially okay, something which in principle is okay, Paul stays away from because it may have a negative impact. And I think that's the connecting link in these chapters here. What's interesting is that Paul often does this. Paul often, it's like Shakespeare said, methinks the lady doth protest too much. And I think Paul often slips into this dynamic that he's often protesting too much. He'll often say things like, I'm telling the truth, I'm not lying. I don't remember any of the prophets in Tanakh having to, assure their readers that they're telling the truth and they're not lying. Paul, is often defending himself when, he gets overly defensive. So he begins this chapter by saying, am I not an apostle? Aren't I an apostle? He says, have I not seen Jesus the Messiah, our Lord? So, it's interesting that I think Paul's need to defend himself here and assert that he is an apostle, I believe, part of it comes from the fact that he is challenged, and I think he faced numerous challenges to the legitimacy of his claim that he's an apostle. The simple reason is that we know that in the Gospels Jesus appoints his 12 apostles, and these are people that Jesus walked with, and Jesus taught, and Jesus knew. And Paul is someone who never met Jesus in the flesh. Paul is someone who really had no knowledge really about the life of Jesus or anything that Jesus taught. When Paul writes, about Jesus, Paul almost never shares anything about the life of Jesus or about anything that Jesus taught. He seems to know very little about Jesus. And so that's a tremendous problem. I mean, how does he make this claim that he's an apostle when he never met Jesus? He seems to know nothing about him. All he really has is his claim that he saw Jesus, right? And clearly he's not talking about seeing Jesus in the flesh. He obviously is speaking about a spiritual experience. He claims to have had a vision of Jesus. And Paul actually believes that throughout his ministry, Jesus repeatedly appears to him and speaks to him. But, there are a few problems that Paul has with this, specifically with the original apostles and with the followers of Jesus that are based in Jerusalem, that are led by James, the brother of Jesus, and you find there Peter and John, etc. They have a few problems with Paul's assertion that he's an apostle. Number one, again, as far as they know, Jesus didn't appoint Paul to be anything. And they knew that Paul never met Jesus. And more importantly, as we're going to see, repeatedly throughout the Christian scriptures, and we will also see in the second century in the writings of the Jewish Christians that survived the first century, the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, that Paul didn't have a lot of credibility with them, specifically because they saw him as an apostate to the law, to the Torah, meaning that Paul was always under a cloud of someone who rejected the binding nature of the Torah in its entirety. Again, the apostles, remembered the preaching of Jesus, that the Torah in its entirety was binding and was important. And, Paul, not because he's being framed, Paul, in his own words, is constantly saying things. We saw this last week. Once he says that as far as he's concerned, there's nothing wrong with eating the meat sacrificed to idols, where we saw that, according to God's very explicit, instructions in the book of Exodus, it is a terrible thing to do. God didn't, give conditions, or God didn't, say it's only wrong if it will cause others to stumble. From God's instructions, it's clear that it's an absolute unconditional prohibition. So, Paul was constantly saying things that made it very clear that when it came to, let's say, specifically the ceremonial laws, the ritual laws, things like the dietary laws and the feasts and the Sabbath and things like that, and certainly the sacrificial system in the temple, Paul showed his cards that he didn't feel that it was binding. And so for this reason, the apostles, the people who were really the followers in the teachings of Jesus, they felt that Paul couldn't be an apostle because he didn't really accurately convey what they had heard from Jesus. So Paul is always under this cloud. Is he really an apostle? What's the deal with him? And all he's able to fall back on is his assertion that, number one, he saw Jesus, but it's simply an assertion. There's no witnesses to it. There's only his claim that Jesus has appeared to him. And, as far as I think any normal person would go, that's not a lot to bank on. It's not very convincing, the fact that a person simply claims that Jesus appeared to them. It's an easy claim to make. Again, especially when what they're teaching in the name of Jesus doesn't square with what they had heard previously. And so all he's able to do is just simply say, I'm an apostle. He just makes the claim, like a stubborn, child. It says, it's my toys and it's my, whatever. He insists that he's an apostle. And he claims that Jesus appointed him as an apostle to the Gentiles. When we get to the book of Galatians, we're going to see that this is not so easy to defend. So that's how the chapter begins, with Paul's assertion that he's an apostle, and therefore he's entitled to be supported by the church, and that even though he's entitled to the support, he's not going to take it. We know that Paul supported himself as a tent maker. We know that's in the 18th chapter of Acts. And again, I think he felt that it might sabotage his ministry if people suspected his motives, that maybe he's just being a preacher man because he can make some money off of it. And it's not necessarily a totally unfounded kind of suspicion. There's really not a lot that I wanted to focus in on in this chapter, but for me it gets interesting when we get to verse 19. So here, Paul goes into a very famous one of his rants. And he says, I'll just read the passage and we'll go back and examine it. He starts in verse 19, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. I mean, we're going to see that for Paul, soul winning is just about the most important thing. And, if you want to find a source in the Christian scriptures for, the focus among evangelicals on winning souls, Paul is certainly, a very, very important source. And so he says that for him, he has become a servant to all people that he might win the more, meaning that he might win more people to faith in Jesus. Now he starts in verse 20. This is the part that's the most important for us. He says, and to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, meaning to those who are under the law, I became as one who is under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. Now, the implication here is, and actually I've seen some translations of Corinthians that actually insert this as parenthetically, where it says, to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, I became as one under the law, although I myself am not under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. In verse 21, to those who are without the law, without the Torah, I became as one who is without the law, although he says in parentheses here, not being without the law toward God, but under the law toward the Messiah, that I might win those who are without the law. So he says again in verse 20 that to the Jews who are followers of the Torah, so he says, I myself became like someone who follows the Torah as well. Why? Not because I really feel that you have to keep the Torah, but I became someone who is like the Jews, one who follows the Torah, in order that I might be successful in converting these Jewish people who are still loyal to the Torah, to those who are without the Torah, to those people who do not observe the Torah. Now, it's not clear what Paul means by this. What does it mean that he's now going to become someone who is without the Torah, just like the Gentiles are? I don't think that Paul means here that he's now going to start violating the civil laws of the Torah or the moral laws of the Torah. I think that's what he says in the parenthetical statement, right? Not that he's going to abandon the laws toward God, but it's sort of a very unclear passage. But in verse 22, he goes on and says, to the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. And then finally he says, I've become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. In verse 23, now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be a partaker of it with you. So this is a very famous and actually controversial passage. And I wanted to look at it from a few different angles. First of all, let's look at it from the angle of Paul's antinomianism, meaning I would take this again as another proof that from Paul's point of view, he does not believe that followers of Jesus are under the obligation of observing the laws of the Torah, at least the ritual and ceremonial laws of the Torah. Let me share a few examples of this. From the Zondervan Study Bible, they say that Paul keeps commandments that he does not have to keep as a believer in Jesus. I mean, that's the way this very reputable evangelical study Bible understands Paul's statement that to the Jews I became a Jew. What does it mean he became a Jew? that he now is keeping commandments that he does not have to keep. Why? Because he's a believer in Jesus. Another reference is the MacArthur Study Bible. And he says, within the limits of God's word and his Christian conscience, he would be as culturally and socially Jewish as necessary when witnessing to Jews. Now, it's very, very strange to talk about culturally and socially Jewish, because there really is no such thing as culturally Jewish. Just as an example, I am much closer, probably culturally, to maybe Italians or Irish people living here in Toronto than I would be to Jews from Morocco or Syria. I think that we eat different foods and we dress differently, and so much that's different about us. So I think when MacArthur here is speaking about culturally and socially Jewish, I don't think he's referring to, the way people dress or the kind of foods they eat. I think that he's equating Jewish practices like the dietary laws and, wearing tzitzit, as that becomes, in his mind, cultural and social. So he says that Paul now is becoming as culturally and socially Jewish as necessary when witnessing to Jews. He was not bound to ceremonies and traditions of Judaism. So again, it seems that according to the vast majority of evangelical commentaries to 1 Corinthians, they accept this idea that Paul was not, from his perspective, and I guess they're saying from a Christian perspective, Paul, as a believer in Jesus, is not bound to the ceremonies and traditions of Judaism. MacArthur goes on to say, all legal restraints had been removed, meaning that all the legal restraints of the Torah were removed from believers in Jesus. But he goes on to say, but there was the constraint of love. And that becomes the operating principle as far as Paul is concerned. In the same way, we saw that last week, he felt that legally he could eat the meat sacrificed to idols, but out of love for weaker Christians, he would refrain from doing so because it would be a stumbling block. And so in the same way here, Paul does not feel he is legally bound to observe any of these ceremonial ritual laws of the Torah, but out of love for Jewish people to see them come to believe in Jesus, he will go along with these practices to be a better witness to them. Now, this kind of approach that I just showed in the Zondervan Study Bible and in the John MacArthur Study Bible, you'll find this in basically all the Christian study Bibles. What is interesting is that David Stern, in his commentary to the to Corinthians, and you'll see this also sort of cited in the Complete Jewish Study Bible, which is based upon David Stern, they're a little bit embarrassed by this. And obviously they don't like the idea, that, Paul is seen in this way as being non-Torah observant. And Stern and this Complete Jewish Study Bible, they try to soften this a bit. So I'm going to share, first of all, the way they translate the verse. And it's really, it's not really translation, it's more of a amplification. This is how they have the verse. With people in subjection to a legalistic perversion of the Torah. That's how they render this idea of being under the law, that they're subjected to a legalistic perversion of the Torah. So Paul says to those people, I put myself in the position of someone under such legalism in order to win those under this legalism, even though I myself am not in subjection to a legalistic perversion of the Torah. That's like a mouthful, but they're trying to say that really it's not that Paul's no longer under the Torah, but that they're really sort of spinning that to he's not under a legalistic perversion of the Torah. Now, what does that mean? So in the Complete Jewish Study Bible Commentary, this is how they explain this, that the Jews are under the law in an oppressive sense, in that for them it is a relentless slave master. This legalistic perversion refers to the result of an individual or group who turns God's Torah, which is based on grace and trust, into a set of rules that must be rigorously followed. Now, I could spend 2 hours on just this one sentence, but I'm going to spare everyone. But it's interesting that basically what this commentary is implying is that for traditional Jews who follow the Torah rigorously, the Torah is an oppressive slave driver, right? Because they are under the law in an oppressive sense, and that for them the law is a relentless slave master. Now, all I can say as someone who tries to live his life according to the teachings of the Torah, both the written Torah and the oral Torah and the teachings of the rabbis, is that this has nothing to do with the way I experience the Torah and I understand the Torah. And I'll be honest, it's not the way any people that I know experience the Torah and understand the Torah. On the contrary, we don't feel that we're under any kind of oppressive legalism. We don't feel that we're under some kind of an oppressive slave driver and slave master. This is an unfortunate, really, a maligning. Really, it's totally misrepresenting the way anyone that I know who follows the Torah experiences the Torah. On the contrary, we would say that the Torah is, and the strictest observance of the Torah is an extremely liberating kind of life. And, I would say this, and the people that I know would say this, we wouldn't trade it in for anything in the world. I think it's unfortunate that usually you'll hear this kind of criticism specifically from people who themselves are not Torah observant, meaning that as people who peek in at Torah observant living from the outside, to them it might seem as oppressive, and to them it might seem as a burden, and it might seem as legalistic and a perversion of the what they think the true Torah is, but it's quite the contrary. It's interesting that I would give a few examples here. Imagine a musician or an athlete who practices rigorously. Imagine like a concert pianist or any Olympic athlete that practices very, very rigorously and religiously, you could even say. They would tell you they're not under any kind of bondage. Really, they would tell you that they're engaged in, for them, something that's the greatest pleasure. The musician that can example. Play music, for hours and hours and hours and hours, when they're practicing their scales, this is something that they want to do because they're so devoted to their craft. So observant Jews are careful to follow the Torah, not because we're under some kind of a oppressive regime that's designed to torture us, but our belief in the Torah says this. God gave us the Torah for our benefit, for our good, and we believe it's the greatest gift that God ever gave us. And the ability to be obedient to God in itself is a tremendous joy. To be able to live a life of obedience to God, even when it's rigorous, even when it's difficult, even when it's not necessarily easy, is still an amazing thing to be able to do. Especially when we understand that following the guidance of God and the laws of the Torah improves us, makes us into different people. And if it was not demanding, it wouldn't change us and it wouldn't improve us at all. The fact is that because it is demanding and it is challenging, and it does take a lot of work, it's precisely that work and that effort that changes those who observe it. But again, as outsiders, like Paul seems to be, and the commentaries I've just quoted, they don't appreciate this. They just look at the Torah from the outside, and they see it in very jaded kind of ways. And they don't realize, and they've never lived a life of Torah observance and have experienced the joy of that kind of observance of following the Torah. If they would only come to, any synagogue on Simchas Torah and, see people who've spent the previous year studying the Torah for countless hours and practicing and living the Torah, picking up that Torah and dancing it with total joy, they would get a very different impression about what it means to live a life of commitment to following the Torah. The reality is that we don't believe that God gave us the Torah and the laws of the Torah to torture us. We believe that God gave us His Torah to bless us, and all you need to do is read the Torah's own assessment of itself. Read Psalm 19, where King David says, "The Torah of God is perfect. It restores the soul." And then read Psalm 119, where you have the longest chapter in the Bible, where for 176 verses, King David writes about the joys and the delights and the beauty and how sweet the Torah is and how delicious it is and how precious it is. You're not reading something by someone who felt the Torah was torture and a burden and oppressive. So it's so incredibly sad when you see these kind of assessments of the Torah that are so disconnected from what Torah living is really all about. Anyway, I could go on for another 25 hours ranting here, but I'll spare everyone. It's interesting that I think at the end of this segment of what I wanted to share, we walk away from the idea that from Paul's point of view, he's only observing the Torah here in order to make himself a more effective missionary to the Jews.
Right.
He's clearly not doing it because he feels that he's under the law, that he is obligated to observe these laws. It's a tactic. It's a way of increasing his effectiveness as as someone who's trying to win Jews to his beliefs. And the truth is, we see that this verse becomes the standard for most modern missions to the Jewish people. Over the years since the Messianic Jewish movement has become popular, going back, let's say at the earliest to the late 1800s, where the roots of this movement, the Hebrew Christian movement, started, and then and that was basically in Russia, primarily in Russia in the late 1800s, and then it moved to England in the early 1900s. It was a movement that was very, very, very you know, insignificant. I mean, it really wasn't much to it. It was just really a movement that had very few people, and it had a little bit of theory behind it. But it wasn't until the 1960s that you began to see Jewish people coming to faith in Christianity to some extent through the work of these Christian missions. And I think that originally, these Christian missions were, putting on the garment of the Torah simply as a way of attracting Jews, of breaking down cultural barriers, in the same way that, Christians famously, tell the story. I forget the name of this missionary, but the fellow who went to China in the 1800s and grew pigtails so he would look like the Chinese people he was witnessing to. That's really what the church was doing in the early days of these Hebrew Christian ministries. They were trying to really, they called it cross-cultural ministry, cross-cultural communication, and it was a way of bridging to the Jewish people by, putting on a yarmulke and putting on a talis, and speaking about and observing Jewish holidays. There was no feeling or belief that these were important in their own right, but they felt it was an effective way of reaching Jewish people. There's a popular video that's going around on the internet of Dr. Michael Brown in Jerusalem wearing a black velvet yarmulke, witnessing to Jews on the streets of Jerusalem. If you would ask him, why is he wearing that black velvet yarmulke? If he would tell you, well, he's doing it just to be more respectful, I think I would ask him, really? Do you think by putting on a black velvet yarmulke you're being more respectful to the Jewish people? I don't think that anyone that would say that is really being honest. The fact is that there's nothing respectful about it, and it's clearly a tactic. Now, what happened, and this is not the time to get into this discussion, but what happened is that as more Jewish people came into the Messianic movement, I think that in their hearts there really was a genuine desire to embrace parts of the Torah. I don't think that all of them were observing the Torah in order to fool other Jewish people. I think that they themselves were drawn to parts of the Torah, and that their Jewish souls cried out to them to not abandon the Torah so quickly. And so that I think they sought to try to combine Christian belief with Jewish practice. And we've seen that over the years, since those early days in the 1960s and 1970s, this Messianic movement became, for many people, the last stop on the way out of the church, back towards normative Judaism. But, it's very clear that the church, in its ministry to Jewish people, took these words of Paul here as its marching orders, and strategy as a way of building bridges, they thought, that would help them be more effective in reaching out to Jewish people and witnessing to Jewish people. Now, the other thing I guess that should be mentioned, and I guess questioned, is whether Paul has a philosophy here of the ends justifying the means. It seems that in the Christian Bible, there are plenty of places where Paul seems to embrace this idea that whatever it takes to advance his cause, he'll do it. There's a famous passage in Philippians chapter 1, verse 18, where Paul says, I believe, something along the lines of, whether in pretense or in truth, the Messiah is preached, I will rejoice. That as far as he's concerned, whether it's in pretense, meaning whether or not there's some subterfuge going on, or it's being truthful, it doesn't make a difference. As far as he's concerned, if Jesus is being advanced and the belief in Jesus is being increased, he's very happy. And there are other places we'll see as we go through Paul's writings where he seems to embrace this idea of doing whatever it takes. Although, to be honest, there are a few places where Paul himself criticizes this kind of duplicity, and we'll see that when we get to the second chapter of Galatians. So Paul himself is a complicated personality, but it seems to me, at least, that this idea of wrapping oneself in Jewish practice and wrapping oneself in the cloak of Torah in order to convert Jewish people, it really flies in the face of a passage from the book of Judges, chapter 14, verse 18. You know, in the famous story of Samson, where, you know, Samson, took a vow, and he was supposed to be a Nazirite, and as a Nazirite, he didn't cut his hair. And the Philistines just wanted to know what's the secret of his strength. And, one of the Philistine women who takes up with Samson is trying everything she can to get his secret out of him. What's the secret of your strength? What's the secret of your strength? And, finally, when she gets it out of him, he says to her, if you didn't plow with my heifer, you wouldn't have discovered my secret. Meaning that he's accusing her, really, of, using him and deceiving him in order to get something that she wanted out of him. And I think that's pretty much what, these Christian missions to the Jews are guilty of. That they, in order to get what they're desiring of, which are Jewish souls, they're very happy plowing with our heifer, meaning that to use our own ammunition against us. And if that means, being hypocrites in the sense that they don't believe it's important to observe these laws of the Torah, and yet go ahead and do it, just as a tactic, it seems to me, at least, to be pretty indefensible on an ethical level. I'll also say one more thing here, by the way, that earlier in the chapter we saw, and last week as well, that Paul was very, very sensitive to, not putting a stumbling block before other believers. And, it's interesting that if Paul really does feel that he's not under these laws, and he really doesn't have to observe these laws, and he's only doing it as a way of improving his ministry to Jewish people who believe that they still are required to observe these laws. So why isn't Paul concerned that he's going to be a stumbling block to other Christians who might also now start observing the Torah? Meaning that we saw that Paul was concerned that if he himself would eat from the food sacrificed to idols, it might be a stumbling block to other Christians. So if Paul really believes that, Christians are not really obligated to observe these laws, and it actually, according to many Christians, observing these laws, cheapens grace, because it creates the impression that somehow our works are really important. What we do is really important. And by, putting a focus and an emphasis on observing the Torah, many Christians believe that it's unhealthy spiritually because it cheapens what Jesus did. It cheapens grace. So it's interesting that Paul, who has been up to this point so sensitive about not putting a stumbling block before other Christians, doesn't seem to be concerned that his observing these laws of the Torah might lead other Christians to do the same thing. I think it's a little bit strange. Just want to quote one more source. I just forgot to mention it before. Again, as an indication that the way traditional Christians see this passage in Corinthians as just indicative of the fact that, after Jesus, there's no longer an obligation to observe the laws of the Torah. So in the ESV Study Bible, they write the following: the Messiah himself had nullified the distinctly Jewish parts of the Mosaic law, which should be, again, anything but the moral law. So again, they would say the moral laws, not stealing, not killing, not, etc., those always apply to all people. But the distinctly Jewish parts of the Mosaic law, which should be the dietary laws, the holidays, the Sabbath, the sacrificial service in the temple, again, according to the ESV Study Bible, the Messiah himself had nullified the distinctly Jewish parts of the Mosaic law. So this idea that, not only Paul is, someone who is not Torah observant, there was a feeling that even Jesus was someone who was against Torah observance. I tried to show in our study of Matthew that I didn't agree with that assessment of Jesus, but I think Paul, to me at least, is clearly in that camp. Okay.
Okay.
So I just had one more little piece to share for tonight, which is towards the end of this chapter, where Paul speaks about the Christian life. He uses the parallel, the analogy of an athlete who trains for their competition, and they have to get into shape, and they're in a fight, and they're in a race, and they want to succeed. So he says in verse 27, "But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." Now, to me, it's not entirely clear what that means. And the truth is, it's a highly controversial verse in this chapter of Corinthians. So Paul is saying that he disciplines his body. It's important to be able to be a disciplined missionary, and to bring it into subjection, to be under control, lest, he says, otherwise, when I have preached to others, if I don't have my body under control, he says, when I preach to others, I myself might become disqualified. Now, the reason this verse is controversial is because some people take this as an indication that a Christian can lose their salvation. Now, this topic is a huge topic. To me, it's actually, as a Jew, it's not that interesting, because it's not something that,
right.
Judaism is necessarily, we don't necessarily believe this, although the Talmud teaches that, all Jews have a share in the world to come, which is widely quoted, although most people don't quote the other half of that passage, which says, but there are those who can lose their share in the world to come. And the Talmud goes into, a number of reasons why a person can lose their share in the world to come, meaning they can lose their eternity. And the Bible itself, by the way, speaks about the kinds of serious sins that a person can commit, that their soul can be cut off. So it's very clear that according to both the Bible and the Talmud, a person never has a guaranteed assurance that they have a share in the world to come. Christianity, basically one of its selling points is that if you believe in Jesus, you will go to heaven. And I guess one of the questions is, okay, but can a Christian ever lose that? Right? There's the famous question, once saved, always saved.
Right.
Is that true? So this passage here is sometimes quoted by people who believe that, no, you can become disqualified, and they take this to mean that a person can lose their salvation. So we're not going to have time to go into this in great detail tonight, there are a number of other places where, it indicates that actually might be the case.
Right.
Probably the most serious one is in the book of Hebrews, chapter 6, where it speaks about someone who's tasted, the connection to Jesus through believing in Jesus, and then they basically renounce their faith.
Hebrews 10:26. Yeah, that's a good one.
Chapter 6 in Hebrews.
Chapter
6.
No, it's 10:26, I believe. For if we sin willfully after that which we have
not sinning willfully, but sort of renouncing their faith.
Gotcha.
And he says there in verse 6, Hebrews chapter 6, verse 6, that there's no going back. Right, that once a person has tasted that,
right,
and they've renounced it, there's no going back. There's no second chances.
So that's kind of like me, because I've actually I was a Christian for years, and then I finally renounced it, and so now he's saying there's no hope for me. But what he's not telling you is the reason why. Once you see that the bridge is broken, why would you want to go back over a broken bridge? That doesn't make any sense. So, but to complement what you were saying, the Hebrews 10:26 one was one that came to my mind about losing your salvation, right? Or having a penalty for your sin, not always being forgiven. Says there remains no more sacrifices for your sins, and then Revelations has one too. I think you and I discussed it once. Says for outside the gates are the idolaters, the fornicators, the murderers. It doesn't say in hell are the fornicators and murderers. It says outside the gates. Now, what does that mean? I guess we'll get to that eventually. So
yeah, I mean, we've actually had this a few weeks ago where Paul speaks about Christians who live a totally morally bankrupt life, and most of the commentaries seem to say that a person living like that, just by their actions, is demonstrating they're not a real Christian.
Right.
And so I guess what comes up in this discussion is, can a Christian lose their salvation? So I guess, most of the commentaries would say, well, if they're really no longer a Christian, right, if they renounce their faith in Jesus, obviously they're not a Christian, so it's not as if a Christian's losing their salvation.
Right.
Or if a person lives their life in a way which is so morally corrupt, that's sort of demonstrating with their action that they're not really believers in Jesus. But there are people who take this, very seriously. As a matter of fact, most of the Christian works that I've studied seem to bank on this idea that salvation is forever and that it cannot be lost, and that once a person is a new creature. They believe that a person who's born again becomes a new creature. They believe that the promises made to that Christian are eternal and are irrevocable. And so it seems that the majority of at least today's Protestant thinkers insist that a Christian cannot lose their salvation, and that once saved, always saved. And yet it doesn't seem to be unanimous. There seem to be voices which question that. But again, tonight we're not going to get into this. We'll wait until we get to the book of Hebrews. And that, cool, my good friend, is really all I really wanted to share tonight.
That was good. That was still a lot. Very nice, sir. That was awesome. Looking forward to next week for sure. So thank you all for tuning in. Rabbi, thank you for tuning in. Always good to have it. Always a good show when you show up. I guess the same could be said about me.
It's good to be here with you.
Somebody's got to click the buttons. All right, fantabulous. All right, well, you have a great week, Rabbi, and shalom to you guys out there in the digital world, and we'll see you guys, Hashem willing, same time, same place next week for 1 Corinthians chapter 10. So y'all take care and have a great, wonderful night. Rabbi, love you, man. Y'all take care.
חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד הכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד